Hello everyone, welcome back to the Java interview questions preparation series. In today's video, we are going to understand everything about the constructors from an interview perspective. For sake of this video, I have created one small presentation in which I will share the questions and answers, and wherever possible, we will also go through the practical examples. So without further delay, let's get started. So the first question that we may get is, what is constructor in a Java? So constructor in a Java is basically a special type of method which is used to initialize an object. It has the same name as the class name. So the constructor name is always same as the class name. The constructor gets automatically invoked when we create the object, and the constructor does not have any kind of return type, not even a void. So this is the basic definition of the constructor. We are going to do the practical examples as well, but let's try to understand what are the different types of constructor before going through the practical example. So you may get these type of questions: what are different types of constructors, or what happens if you don't write any constructor in a class? So you may get these type of variations of the questions, but the answer is basically the same. So there are two different types of constructors in a Java. First one is a default constructor. So default constructor is nothing but a constructor without any parameters. This constructor gets automatically provided by the Java compiler if we or if developer does not provide any type of constructor. So basically, the default constructor is given by the compiler itself if we as a user don't write our own constructor. The default constructor basically initializes the object with the default values like a 0 for the integers or null for the object. So this is the basic definition of the default constructor. The second type of constructor is parameterized constructor. So a constructor with the parameters to initialize an object with the specific values. So if required, we can create our own parameterized constructor where we can provide some values so that those values will be assigned to the object that we are creating. So this is the parameterized constructor. So let's try to understand everything about these two slides that we just seen with the help of some practical examples. So if I just go to the IntelliJ, over here I have created one class called as a student. In the student, I have used two variables called as a roll number and the name. And below, I have just created the getters and setters. Inside the main method, I have just created a main method, and now inside the main method, let's try to create object of this student class. So in order to create the object, we just have to write student, and then we have to give the name like student, and then we have to use a new keyword and student again. So over here, if you just observe, we have used this student and we have used a bracket. So this is nothing but a constructor that we are just calling. Okay. So this is basically used to create the object and initialize the values. So as of now, if you just see, we have not created any kind of constructor, right? So we have not created any kind of constructor. We just have variables, main method, and then getters and setters, but we don't have any constructors in the class. So here is the default constructor comes into a picture. As we have not used or we have not created any constructor in the class, that is the reason Java itself is providing the default constructor. So as we have already seen in the presentation, a default constructor is nothing but a constructor which is automatically provided by the Java if no other constructors are defined, right? So as we have seen, this is the constructor which is given by the Java itself. Now, if I just try to print out the value, like for example, student dot get a roll number, and similarly student dot get name, something like this. So now as we are using the default constructor, it will initialize the values to the default values. So as the roll number is integer, it will initialize the roll number with a 0, and name is nothing but string object, then it will initialize the name with a null value. So if I just try to run this code, then we should get the values like 0 and a null. So as you can see on the terminal, we are getting values as a 0 and null. So this is all about the default constructor. Now let's suppose if we want to create our own constructor, then how we can do this? So in order to do this, it is pretty simple. We just have to write a public or any access modifier that we want to use. I'll just use a public. And then the next rule that we have to follow is constructor name must be same as a class name. So in this case, my class name is student, so that I have to give the constructor name as a student, and then we have to give a brackets and we have to give these curly brackets. Inside the curly brackets, we can give the body that we want to give. As of now, I'll just give one simple statement called as a this is inside the constructor, something like this, and I will just save the file. I'll just save the code. Now on line number 13, we are creating the object, and as I said, the constructor gets called when we create the object. So now if I just try to run this code, I should see the message that this is inside the constructor, and yes, as expected, we are getting this message. Now, this is the default constructor that we just seen. We have second type of constructor which is called as a parameterized constructor. So parameterized constructor is nothing but a constructor where we can give the parameters and initialize the values with the required as we have given at the time of object creation. So how we can do this? So let me just remove this constructor first of all, and now we can just add one constructor again called as public student, and this time we can give some parameters. So in order to initialize the roll number and name, I may require the two different parameters. Let me just give int r for the roll number and string n for the name, and whatever value I will receive through the parameters, what I will do, I'll just assign it to the roll number like this, and for the name like this. And now I'll just save this code. Now as soon as I saved this code, I started getting the error on line number 14. So if you just seen over here, it is saying that expected two arguments but found 0. So reason behind this is because as we have given our own constructor, this time Java will not provide any default constructor, and that is the reason we have one and only one constructor in the class which accepts the parameters, and that is the reason we must have to give the parameters. Now the first parameter that we have to pass is a roll number, and second one, that is a name. And now if I just pass roll number as 1 and let's suppose name as Raj, so this time it should create one object with initial values of roll number 1 and name with the Raj. If I just save the code and if I just try to run this code on the terminal, we should be able to see the message or the values, that is 1 and Raj. And yes, as expected, we are able to see these values. Now let's suppose if I want to create the second object, then yes, we can just create a second object using the same constructor. This time we can give the different values. Let's suppose roll number 2 and name as Harsh, and then we can print the value of this student to 1, something like this. And if I just try to run this code, then I should be able to see all the values, and yes, as expected, we are able to see all the values. So with this example, what we understood, we can, if we don't provide any constructor, then Java itself provides one default constructor, and if we want to create one parameterized constructor, then this way we can create the parameterized constructor. Okay, and while we use a parameterized constructor, in order to create the object, we must have to give all the parameters, all the values that is required by the constructor. So this is all about a different types of constructor. Now if I just go back to the presentation, the next question that you may get is like, can a class have more than one constructor, or what is constructor overloading, or there are any rules to overload the constructor? So this type of questions you may get, and the answer is basically pretty simple. So yes, we can have a multiple constructors in the same class. This concept is called as a constructor overloading. So when we create multiple constructors in the same class, This is nothing but called as a constructor overloading. So there is one rule: each constructor must have a different type of or different number or type of parameters. So when we use a constructor overloading, there is one rule that we have to keep in mind is each constructor must have a different number or different type of parameters. So this is all about the constructor overloading. Now let's try to understand this practically. So if I just go back to the class student, over here we have just created one constructor which accepts roll number and a name as a parameter, and we can create object using that roll number and a name. But let's suppose if I just have one scenario where I just want to create one more constructor and I just want to use a roll number to initialize the object. So in that case, I can just take one parameter with roll number, and then I can just give the value to the roll number, something like this. And this time we have two different constructors. We have one constructor which accepts roll number and name, and then we have a second constructor which accepts which accepts only roll number. So over here, if you just observe, these constructors are differentiated by the number of parameters. So first constructor accepts two parameters, second one accepts only one parameter. Okay. Now, if we want, we can just create one more constructor which will accept only string to initialize the name, something like this. So let me just give the name using name is equals to n. And now this time, this particular constructor that I have selected accepts only one parameter, and the new constructor also accepts only one parameter. But this time, these two constructors are differentiated by the type of parameter. First one accepts integer and second one accepts a string value. So over here, the rule is the constructor must be differentiated by number of parameter or by a type of parameter. So this is the basic thumb rule that we have to follow. Now, in order to create the object, let me just remove this code. And in order to create the object, we just have to call student is equals to new student. And this time we have three different choices. Either we can give roll number name, or only roll number, or only name. So let's suppose if I just want to give only name, so I'll just call this particular constructor. And if I just try to print out the values like student dot get name and student dot get roll number. So in this case, as we have just assigned a name, it will print a name as a Raj, but we haven't assigned a roll number. So it will print the default value of integer, which is nothing but a 0. So let me just run this code, and yes, as expected, it is printing Raj, which is the name, and 0, which is default value of integer for the roll number. So yes, so I hope you got the idea like how we can use the constructor overloading. Okay. Now if I just go back to the presentation, then the next questions that we may get is, can a constructor call another constructor in the same class? Then what is constructor chaining? What is use of this and super statement in the Java? Then what is order of execution when a subclass object is created? So you may get these type of kind of variations of a questions, but the answer is pretty simple. When one constructor calls another constructor, it is called as a constructor chaining. So when one constructor calls another constructor, it is called as a constructor chaining. In order to call a constructor in the same class, we have to use a this statement, and in order to call a constructor from our parent class, we have to use a super statement. By default, super class constructor is called using super statement, then the subclass constructor is executed. So we will try to understand this practically, but just keep this in a mind that we can use this statement in order to call the constructor in the same class, and we can use a super statement in order to call the constructor from the parent class. We can also send the parameters and everything. Let's try to understand this by practical. Now, if I just go back to the IntelliJ and let me just close this particular example, and if I just go to the class called as a person, so let me just open this particular class. So over here, if you just observe this particular class called as a person, I have used um the three basic values for the person, that is name, age, and gender, and then I just have these getters and setters for these values. Then I have one more class called as a employee, which extends to the person. So employee is a base class, or employee is a child class, and person is a super class. Okay. In the employee, we have few additional variables called as a ID and department. So again, in the person, we have name, age, and gender. In the employee, we have ID and department. And again, in the employee class, I have this main method and getter setters for the ID and department. So this is how I have created this employee class. Now let's try to understand how we can use these and super statements uh, in order to call the use the constructor chaining. Now over here, if I just want to create employee class object, then in order to do this, we have to just write employee is equals to new employee, which is pretty simple. And again, we can just print the value using getters over here. But let's try to create one constructor over here, which is public. And let me just use employee. And then as of now, I don't have any parameters over here. Let's try to print using some basic statements like this is a child class constructor. Okay. And similarly, we can just copy this code, and we can just first of all try to run this code over here. I'm just creating the object of employee, so constructor of employee should get called, and this message should get printed on the terminal. So if I just run the code, then yes, as expected, we are able to see that this is child class constructor. Now s- let's try to do similar thing in the class person, because the employee is extending to the person, and that is the reason the person value should also get initialized, right? And that is the reason, in order to initialize person values, we may have the person constructor. As of now, we have not given any constructor. That is the reason um, the Java itself is providing the default constructor. So let me just use public, then person, and let me just give the statement as this is a parent class constructor, something like this. And now let me just save this code. Before running this code, if I just go back to the presentation, over here, if you just run the last line or last question, what is order of execution when a subclass object is created? So what is order of execution when subclass object is created? And the answer is, by default, superclass constructor is called using a super statement, then the subclass constructor is executed. So over here we have similar situation. We have employee, and we are just printing this one simple statement inside the employee constructor. But before this, parent class constructor must be executed. So let's see whether it executes or not. So if I just try to run this code, then yes, if you just observe the execution or flow, first of all, it is printing that this is parent class constructor, and the second statement that it is printing that this is a child class constructor. So over here, even though we haven't used a super statement, the parent class constructor is getting executed first, and then it is executing the child class constructor. So if you by default, if you call or not, no matter, Java itself will call the parent class constructor. Now let's suppose, in order to call the parent class constructor, we just have to use one small statement called as a super, something like this. And this super statement must be the first statement of the constructor body, right? So we can't um, write super statement over here. So if you just write over here, we will get one error like call to super must be the first statement in the constructor body. So let me just again make this super, and let me just try to run this code again. We will get the same output. Yes, as expected, we are getting the same output. So this is how we can use a super statement in order to call the parent class constructor. Now let's suppose if our parent class constructor accepts some parameters. So let's suppose if I just create one parameterized constructor for the person with the parameters like name, then age, and then a gender. So if our parent class constructor takes some parameters, then let me just give the values like name is equals to n, then age is equals to a, and then gender is equals to g, something like this. And now, okay, so let me just change this to the string. It must be integer, but as of now, let's keep it as a string only. And now, if I just go back to the employee, now inside the super, we have to give all these parameters because our parent class constructor accepts the parameters. So first of all, we have to give the name, then age, and then gender. So over here for the super, we can just give the name as, let's suppose, Raj, then age as, let's suppose, 10, and then we have to give gender as M, something like this. And now let me just save this code. And before like executing, let's try to print the values. Something like this. And now let me just save this code, and now let me just run this code. Over here it is printing that this is a child class constructor. Yes, so it is just printing the message that we have given, but also it is printing the values like Raj as a name, 10 as age, M as a gender, and 0 and null. So for um, ID and department, it is printing 0 and null. The reason is because we haven't assigned any value to the ID and department. It is giving us the default values for the integer and string. But this super statement is basically calling our parent class constructor, and in the parent class variables, it is assigning values. For the name, it is assigning Raj. For age, it is assigning 10, and for gender, it is assigning M. So this is how we can use a super statement in order to call the parent class constructor. Now let's try to understand how we can use this statement in order to call the constructor from the same class. So again, to understand this statement, I have back to my student class, and over here again we have roll number and name. Let me just remove this constructor that we previously created, and we can use this particular parameter, something like this. And now everything is looking good. If we just run this code, it will just print value of these name and roll number, which are nothing but the default values for the string and integer. So this is how currently this particular code is working. Now let's suppose if we have multiple constructors. So let's suppose if I have one constructor with 0 parameters, something like this, and then we have one constructor with some parameters. So this time let me just add the parameters like integer R for roll number and string N for the name. And let me just assign roll number is equals to R and name equals to N, something like this. And now let's try to assign the values over here. Like for roll number, let me just assign 1. For name, let me just assign Raj in order to create the object. And then if we just try to run this code, we should be able to print the name and roll number, which is as expected. And yes, we are able to see these particular messages. Now let's suppose if someone calls these zero parameter constructor, then basically all these values will be initialized to the default values. For integer it will give 0, for string it will give null, right? But let's suppose we don't want this case. If someone calls these zero parameter constructor, then we want to assign some different values as a default values, then we can just call this particular constructor from the zero parameter constructor. So how we can do this? We have to just use a this, and then we have to give the two different parameters. First one is a roll number. So let's suppose I will just give default as 100, and for name let me just give NA, which is non-applicable, something like this, and let me just give the semicolon at the end. Now what will happen when someone will call this zero parameterized constructor? It will automatically call the parameterized constructor using this statement, and then it will assign 100 as a roll number and NA as a name. So if I just try to run this code, let me just remove, or let me just create one more object over here. Let me copy it, paste it, and we can just give student1 as a name, and this time we can just remove these parameters. So on the line number 22, we are calling a zero parameterized constructor. So it will just call the zero parameterized constructor, and again inside the zero parameterized constructor, we are just using this statement, and we are assigning the value 100 as a roll number and NA as a name. Now if I just try to run this code, we should be able to see these messages on the screen. And yes, as expected, for first object we are able to see the Raj and 1 because we are assigning those values, and for second object we are able to see NA and 100 because we are just calling zero parameterized constructor, and that zero parameterized constructor internally calling the parameterized constructor and assigning NA as a name and 100 as a roll number. So I hope you got the idea like how to use a this statement. Again, this statement is used to call a constructor within the same class. On the other hand, as we have already seen, super statement is used to call a constructor from the parent class. The next question that we have is kind of a simple yes or no questions. Wherever again possible, we will try to understand this using some practical examples. So the first question that we may get is, can you inherit a constructor in a Java? So answer is no. We cannot inherit a constructor in the Java class, because a class constructor is itself because a constructor is totally a class property. So we cannot inherit the constructor in the parent class. We can call it using super statement, but we cannot inherit it. The second question that we may get is, can a constructor call a method? Then yes, a constructor can call a method. So just to understand, if I just go back to the IntelliJ, and over here inside the student class, let's suppose we can add one method. Just to understand, we can just add public void display, something like this, and inside the display method, let me just give the message like this is display method, something like this. And this display method, if we want, we can call it from the student constructor, something like this. And if I just try to run the code, then we should be able to see the message on the terminal. This is a display method. So yes, we can call a method from the constructor. Then the third question that we can get is, can a constructor be a private? So yes, the constructor can be a private. And the use case of using a private constructor is to prevent object creation from outside of the class. So again, if the constructor is private, we cannot create object of private constructor class outside of the class. So in order to understand this, if I just go back uh, to my student class, and if I just try to create one private constructor, let me just remove this code. Let me just create one private constructor, something like this. And let me just comment out this code. Let me just remove this object creation also for Raj, because as of now we just have only a zero parameterized constructor. So yes, if you just see, we have now private constructor, and using private constructor we can create the object inside the same class. But if I just go to some another class, let's suppose if I just go to the employee class, and inside the employee class, if I just try to create a student class object, then this time we will get the error. The error is saying that the student has a private access, so that we cannot create a constructor. But again, in the student, if I just try to make it as a public, then we will not get this error. But if constructor is private, then we will get the error. We will not be able to create an object of student class outside of this particular class. So this is how the private constructor works. Then can constructor throw the exception? Then yes, definitely constructor can throw the exception. Let's try to understand again. So if I just go back to my student class, and if my constructor wants to throw the exceptions, let's suppose throw new exception, or let's suppose inside we can just throw the runtime exception, then yes, we can throw the exception. Okay, we are not getting any error, we can throw the exception. If I just try to run this particular code, then we must get this particular exception. Yes, a constructor can throw the exceptions. The next question is, can a constructor be a static, final, or abstract? So constructor cannot be a static, it cannot be a final, and it cannot be a abstract also. So why constructor cannot be a static? Because constructor is tied to object creation, not the class itself, so it cannot be a static constructor. Then can constructor be a final? No, constructors cannot be a final, because constructors are not inherited, so there is no need to use a final keyword for the constructor. Can constructor be abstract? So again, constructor cannot be abstract, since it must always be implemented, because if we use a abstract, then we cannot give the body, and that is the reason we cannot use abstract keyword with the constructor. Why? Because for the constructor we must have to give the body. That is the reason we cannot use abstract keyword with it. If you just try to use it, you will get the errors. So if I just try to make this constructor as static, then we will get the error saying that modifier static is not allowed. If we just try to use a final, then again we will get the error saying that modifier final is not allowed. And if we just try to use abstract, then again we will get the error saying that modifier abstract is not allowed here. So we cannot use static, final, and abstract keywords with the constructor. So these are the simple yes or no questions, but kind of important questions that we may get in the interview. Then the next slide that we have is a copy constructor. So what is copy constructor? So copy constructor is nothing but a constructor which creates a new object as a copy of an existing object. Java does not provide a built-in capability for the copy constructor, but if we want, we can create our own copy constructor. Okay, so this is again an important question to understand the copy constructor. Java does not provide the functionality for the copy constructor, but if we want, we can create a copy constructor. So what copy constructor exactly is? A constructor which creates a new object using existing object. So let's try to understand what I'm trying to say over here. So if I just go back to the IntelliJ, and if I just try to open a class called as a customer, inside the customer, what I have done is, again, I have created the two variables, that is ID and name. Again, we have getters and setters for the ID and name, and then we have the main method. So over here, let's try to create one constructor called as a public, and then let's suppose customer. And this is nothing but uh, kind of a parameterized constructor. So we have to use integer I for ID, and string n for the name. And what we can do, what we can just do, we can just assign I to the ID and n to the name, something like this. This is pretty simple, right? Because we have already seen this. Now, in order to create the customer a class, what we can just do, we can just use this particular constructor of customer, and we can just assign ID as 1 and name as Raj over here, something like this. And if I just try to print out the ID and name, then we just have to use get ID and get name, something like this. This is again, we have already seen all of this, so I'll not explain it again. I'll just run it as it is, and we are able to see the messages like 1 and Raj on the um, terminal. Now let's suppose I have this object created with the name original, and I just want to create one more object but with exact same values that this original object have. So in this case, we can create a copy constructor. So in order to create a copy constructor, what I have to do, I have to just again use a public, then customer, and then over here, we have to take one parameter. But this time we don't have to take any integer or string. Instead, we have to take customer object itself as a parameter, something like this. And what we have to do, we have to just use id is equals to c dot id, and then name is equals to c dot name, something like this. And this is nothing but a copy constructor. How to call this? We have already created one object which is having name as original, and then again what we have to do, we have to just use customer. Let's suppose duplicate is equals to new customer, and this time we have to send this original object as a parameter like this. And again, if we just try to print out the values of the duplicate, so let me just copy the name and let me just print over here, something like this. And now if I just try to run this code, we should be able to see the one Raj, which is the value from original object, and again 1 and Raj, which are values from the duplicate object. So this time what we are just doing, we are just creating a copy of our object. So we are just creating copy, exact same copy from original, and saving it into the duplicate object, and we are just using that duplicate object to print the value. So this way we can create a copy constructor. So I hope you got the idea, what is the constructor in the Java and how this constructor works in the Java. I just tried to segregate all the questions based on the categories that we may get into in the interview. So if you still have any questions, let me know into a comment section. I will try my best to answer those questions. I hope you enjoyed this session, and I'll see you in the next session.